Fallout 76, there's a topic I wasn't expecting to revisit anytime soon, but here we are. There's a Kotaku article that has investigated what happened behind the scenes, the disastrous development that led to its disastrous launch. The article is called The Human Toll of Fallout 76's Disastrous Launch, for those of you who just want to check it out by yourself and read it. The article was edited by Sissy Jiang, and yeah, none of the details in this article are particularly surprising, but it's good to get confirmation, as is information that needs to get out there so we know where the problems are and we can strive to improve an industry that needs a lot of improvement. But the opening statement is a pretty strong one. One former developer from Fallout 76 told Kotaku this: no one wanted to be on that project because it ate people. It destroyed people. The amount of people who would go to that project and then they would quit Bethesda was quite high. The article mentions later on that at one point Todd Howard said during the marketing campaign of Fallout 76 that this was a game that all of us at Bethesda wanted to make, a multiplayer Fallout game. Not many people at Bethesda wanted to work on this game, make this game, or be involved in this game, as we'll learn. So Kotaku spoke to 10 former employees, and testers were among the ones who complained most about their work experience. They crunched 10-hour days for 6 days a week. Some testers would only find reprieve when they finally left the Fallout 76 team. And after leaving the project, I didn't cry last night when I was taking a shower. I pulled into work today and I sat in a car for a second, and my chest didn't feel heavy like it normally does. Making video games shouldn't be hell, but somehow it can be. Making video games should be fun. Hard work, but fun. And yet, this industry has normalized treating workers like crap for so long that for many, it straight up feels like traumatizing hell. That's how they present their experience at these kinds of work environments. Former tester who worked on the game's DLC recalled being coerced into coming in to crunch on the weekend because the latest version of the game needed a fix. The individual tester would later discover that the development team had not implemented the fix and that any work they did on the unfixed build would be for nothing. And right here we have a quote. I remember seeing one of my coworkers stand up, look at the person who was in charge that day and scream across the room, "Why are we here? We gave up our day for this. This build isn't the build we need. This is useless. This is a waste of time. Like, why are we here?" You know, a lot of the blame throughout Fallout 76's launch and the backlash was placed on the QA testers. Oh my god, these QA testers just didn't spot the bugs. How the hell can QA testers miss this stuff? I mean, the bugs are so blatant, but the blame on QA testers is completely misplaced because they're actually the ones doing their jobs. They're the ones who are pointing out the bugs and the stuff that needs fixing, but it's ultimately up to the development team to take that feedback and implement them, and it's up to them to supply the QA testers with builds that will allow them to test it out, to provide the feedback that the developers need to then fix that stuff. So the QA testers had it rough because they were the ones who were being blamed for stuff that wasn't their fault at all. They're just the messengers of the stuff that needs to be fixed, and that stuff was communicated. But Bethesda's development pipeline for Fallout 76 and the development team just really couldn't fix stuff on time before launch, or couldn't provide the QA testers with the necessary builds for them to be able to do their jobs. It is then detailed how QA contractors have low hourly pay, and permanent employees aren't faring much better than that. And the ultimate goal is to become a permanent employee, as you do get slightly higher pay, but also certain benefits, and you really get to be a part of that company and maybe climb the ladder. And that's the carrot that tends to be dangled in front of contractors to have them work harder. And then beyond that, when QA staff got called in for weekend crunch, the possibility of being paid an extra $200 that week and the opportunity to eat free pizza was kind of the carrot that was dangled, but they did not make up for their work circumstances, according to former QA testers. I mean, we got overtime, but like all the money in the world doesn't matter at that point. When we did weekend work, they would get pizza for us. It takes time to, come out of that mindset and realize, yeah, they're giving us something for free, but it's not worth it. And it's kind of the same with the overtime money. It's like, yeah, it's more money, but at what cost? No amount of free pizza is worth the pain and turmoil and the trauma that so many of these developers experience in the development of Fallout 76. A couple of former ZeniMax employees tell Kotaku that no amount of financial incentive could erase the physical and mental exhaustion they experience from the continual onslaught of nonstop, obligatory overtime. Two sources claim that they tried to flag the issue to Rob Gray, the director of QA, but he continuously deflected or denied that crunch was happening in his department. So beyond the fact that QA testers were being blamed for things that just weren't up to them. There is the director of QA who was poorly managing employees. They tried to present issues to Rob Gray, but he would just deny that crunch was happening at all and tried to pretend like everything was honky-dory despite employees coming to him and complaining about the work situation. So really, it is all about management and how they're dealing with the work environment. It's really them who are to be blamed for the traumatized workers and the disastrous launch of Fallout 76. One QA source recounted how badly they wanted to stop working despite their financial need. When they almost broke a bone on the stairs, they fantasized about the prospect of being too injured to go to work the next day. They said it was the most comforting feeling they felt while working crushing hours on Fallout 76. Think about that for a second. Imagine how bad the work conditions must have been to fantasize about breaking your bone, to deem taking a break for having broken a bone more worthwhile than going into work to work on this video game. Beyond that, the work environment encouraged testers to turn against each other. Testers also coped with the pressures of being surveilled. QA workers would have their breaks timed or sometimes even be followed into the restrooms by chronic snitches, otherwise normal testers who felt that micromanaging their peers would help their career standing at ZeniMax, because there's that carrot that they constantly dangle of, hey, maybe you'll become a permanent worker. And that carrot is distributed so infrequently that workers feel like they have to do whatever it takes to stand out above the rest to try to move up this ladder. Fallout 76's launch only brought new problems. QA testers now had to endure constant vitriol from players who were dissatisfied with the buggy state of the game, who blamed QA testers, who it wasn't up to them to fix the game. They just had to report what was the issue. The developers failed to fix that stuff. Management failed to create a pipeline that would allow developers to fix that stuff on time, and they rushed the game out before it was fully baked in the oven. That's on management. Some staff received death threats. I mean, that's where this no longer becomes a constructive discussion. It just becomes a wild, wild west of insane people. And so the QA department being run so poorly led to them constantly losing headcount, but it wasn't the only department that was in trouble. Fallout 76's management team drafted developers from all over the ZeniMax umbrella, and to the point where other projects were negatively affected. Arcane Studios' Redfall and Bethesda's upcoming Starfield both lost team members to the black hole of Fallout 76, which reminds me a lot of what happened with Mass Effect Andromeda and Anthem with BioWare, where team members were pulled from other projects because Mass Effect Andromeda was such a troubled project, and that forced all hands on for that, and that led to other projects being delayed, their pipeline being clogged because people had to be pulled from those projects to help out with this house of cards that was falling apart, and Fallout 76 seems to be no different on that front. Kotaku then brings up what Todd Howard said to IGN, that we've gotten much, much better at managing crunch. He had framed the personnel shifting as a positive. In truth, the post-launch content for Fallout 76 took a demoralizing toll on employees across the ZeniMax network. How could it not? You were working on something that you didn't believe in, really, that you didn't want to make, that you didn't feel like it was part of Bethesda's identity, and then it launches. It proves your pessimism when it comes to not believing in this project, but not believing that this would be something that would be received positively, and then shit hits the fan, and you're getting all this backlash that you knew was coming, and you wasted all these years working on a project that you weren't fully into, that you didn't think people would be fully into. That must be just such an awful position to be in. Some sources noted that the project drove an exodus of senior developers who had worked on some of Bethesda's most prolific titles. Even longtime veterans did not want anything to do with this game and were sick and tired of just how poorly managed this game was. Many developers developed physical health issues such as tinnitus and back pain. Senior staff who'd remained loyal to the company for 20 years finally found their reason to quit. Fallout 76 was their breaking point. People don't need to suffer so that patch 42 can come out on time. It is a deliberate decision to foster a workplace and a work cycle where that can happen. One source said it's prioritizing the work over the people. 100% hit the nail on the head. That's game companies in general. That's the issue. That's the problem. When you don't prioritize people, the folks who are actually making the game, the people who need to be in tip-top shape and who need to be happy to do their best work, then the project itself is going to suffer, and future projects may very well suffer if you don't kind of root out the issue at its core. Sources said they had seen the writing on the wall when it comes to Fallout 76's Disastrous launch. Remember the whole, hey, we're not going to have any NPCs in Fallout 76. Releasing a follow-up with 0 NPCs, on the other hand, was a more brazen gamble that did not sit comfortably with developers. Todd Howard presented it like it was this grand idea where people would be each other's NPCs. The audience, the players, the gamers, the community were very skeptical about a Fallout game without NPCs and an online game without NPCs. The developers shared the same pessimisms, but management insisted that this was the way to go, despite the developers themselves telling them, hey, I don't think this is a good idea. A couple sources Kotaku spoke with didn't feel that the teams had a coherent direction for Fallout 76 or what it was supposed to be during its initial 3-year development cycle. Todd Howard was supposed to be in charge, but spent most of his time working on Starfield, and then he would just fly by later and shit all over an idea that had popular traction within the design team. So when there was a direction that the team came up with while Todd Howard was away, he would hop back in and say, actually, that's crap. Go back to, this idea. Let's do no NPCs. Bethesda leadership did not fully anticipate the challenges of producing a full-fledged live service game. Really? Bethesda is not known for their live services. The creation engine is certainly not built for live services. It's barely working as a single-player engine, and they thought, yeah, let's make an online game off of this. Bethesda seemed to assume that putting Rockstar senior developers with extensive Elder Scrolls and Fallout single-player experience on Fallout 76 would smooth out any difficulties. I don't know what kind of logic that is. They're veterans of single-player experiences, but multiplayer is a whole different beast. One source told Kotaku as the game increased in size and scope, no additional time was ever really given for testing. You don't say. That doesn't come as a surprise at all. The game launched in a state where people could perceive, okay, testing was a major issue for this game. Not enough time was given for that. And that's not the fault of QA testers. Again, that's the fault of management and how they handle this whole development cycle. A full pass of this huge multiplayer game with multiple expansions, QA got 3 days in a good week. It was 1 day of production issues resulted in a late build being delivered. So QA was ready to work, but they weren't given the material to work with. And so they just kind of sat around a lot of the days just not being able to do anything constructive or useful. The game's designers raised various questions and concerns about griefing, multiplayer stability issues, and quest checkpointing, concerns that were dismissed or postponed by, well, surprise, surprise, management. Not QA testers, not developers, management just weren't managing properly. Effective multiplayer design requires precise mathematical knowledge. Designers weren't given the resources to derive that information. It's this domino effect starting from management of just clogging of pipelines that just further delayed things, and the issues eventually added up and the toilet just started flooding, essentially is how it put it. Todd Howard gave an IGN interview about how Fallout 76 was a game that we wanted to play, that we wanted to make. That was, well, BS. In reality, morale was also very low among some former Fallout 4 developers who were assigned to work on Fallout 76. They were working in a genre they had little interest in, and then 2 sources relate to Kotaku that many former Fallout 4 developers they knew especially resented being assigned to make a live service game. So yeah, Todd Howard spoke for the whole team, saying yeah, no, this is our passion project. It certainly wasn't a sentiment shared by the people actually making the game, the development team who were in the trenches actually, building the game. They were just so woefully unhappy with the kind of project that this was and just how things were going and how poorly managed it all ultimately was and the kind of awful work environment that was creating. Developers from the main Rockville office had a chip on their shoulder about the success of live service games. Some senior developers at the main Rockville studio were not enthused about Fallout becoming a live service franchise, and neither were Fallout fans, Fallout audiences, just gamers in general. They've always perceived Fallout to be this single-player experience that was tailored to the player. So it's developers and audiences were on the same page. It was management who were the outliers who were trying to make this thing work. And we all know how that turned out at launch. The report then delves into how talent from Bethesda Austin, well known as a multiplayer studio, and ZeniMax Online, who are the developers of Elder Scrolls Online, were utilized, and 2 sources did not believe that the 2 studios' online multiplayer expertise was utilized to its fullest potential until after Fallout 76 launched, and that would explain why things did over time improve significantly with Fallout 76. It's much more stable now, but at launch in the months and even years that followed, it was just, a disaster. Employees with multiplayer experience said they pointed out major problems during production, but they would not be satisfactorily addressed until after the scathing reviews at launch. The multiplayer experts were telling them there are problems here are the problems, but they decided to ship the game without addressing these issues first, and the results speak for themselves. Multiplayer studio successes were not internally given as much merit or considered aspirational. Basically, the single-player stuff got rockstar status, while the multiplayer stuff was more kind of sidelined, and then kind of not taking their feedback seriously. Fallout 76 just had a hard time being in a polished state as a multiplayer experience that's very different from a single-player experience. A source told Kotaku that senior Bethesda developers basically treated Elder Scrolls Online like it was a complete fluke. There was no respect at all for the hard work and dedication that it took to make an MMO that is still running and is still popular. While we had experienced multiplayer designers in both Rockville and Austin, they were routinely sidelined and ignored. Yeah, the results of Fallout 76 certainly convey that very clearly. Again, entirely not surprised by any of this information. One of the major criticisms of Fallout 76 was that it launched with no NPCs to interact with. Almost none of the Bethesda designers wanted the game to launch without NPCs because that's just freaking nonsensical for a Fallout game that's supposed to be story-driven and, the world changes around the player's decisions, all these things that were highlights of Bethesda, that is gone without NPCs. And of course, eventually, later on with an expansion, Fallout 76 did reintroduce NPCs because the developers who were skeptical about not including NPCs were right, and management and executive producer Todd Howard and whatnot were wrong. But at the time, during development, executive producer Todd Howard was not willing to budge all the way up till launch. So Todd Howard was a major contributor to Fallout 76's issues, it would seem. One source said that the amount of work required to adapt the engine to support a multiplayer experience put additional time pressure on the schedule. Some desirable features would have to go, and leadership decided one such feature would be NPCs. I don't even know if NPCs I'd call a feature. It is such a fundamental aspect to a role-playing game that it's baffling that this idea was brought up at all, that management insisted on this at all. But beyond managerial decisions, technical factors contributed to the game launching without NPCs, all thanks to the Bethesda's creation engine, which again is barely holding itself together with single-player experiences. I was very skeptical to hear that engine was being repurposed for multiplayer. It created difficult challenges that the developers hadn't encountered before. Kotaku then aptly points out that the creation engine is traditionally a single-player engine, then delves into talking about having to retrain employees. Bethesda was unusual in how frequently it was able to retain staff for over a decade. It would cost a significant amount of time and money to retrain senior employees in new scripting languages. The creation engine was supposed to be the lesser evil. Instead, it created complex problems that constantly required more people in the QA department. Basically, the thought process was, if we use an engine we're familiar with, then it's gonna make life easier for the development of Fallout 76. But as it turns out, if you're using an engine that just was far from tailor-made for a multiplayer experience and that was barely holding its own, even with single-player stuff, it was just going to create more problems, and they might as well have just kind of dug themselves into a hole. Yes, the tool is familiar, but it was just so not intended for a game like Fallout 76 that it ended up screwing them over. Fallout 76's tools were so poorly optimized that simply updating the build could break it, and this was something that players experienced as well. There were numerous instances in which a Fallout 76 update would release and it would break other aspects of the game. It was like playing whack-a-mole with bugs, or it was like trying to slay a Hydra where you chop off one head and two more would take its place. QA say they were forced to accommodate for such errors with crunch, typically racking up between 10 to 16 hours of work a day. Management screwed up, and guess who paid for it? QA. Bethesda ideally would not have used the single-player engine to make a multiplayer game. In Fallout 4 and Skyrim, if a player isn't in an area, then the game thinks that area doesn't exist. In online games, though, areas have to exist at all times, highlighting just the huge disparity when it comes to designing a single-player game versus a multiplayer game. Fallout 76 struggled with trying to make everything exist at all times because that's just not how the creation engine, a single-player focused engine, was built for. Further highlighting that the disastrous launch of Fallout 76 was not QA's fault. In general, every major bug in Fallout 76 that appeared at launch was known by QA, reported by QA, but the developers, for one reason or another, weren't able to act on that feedback. And it didn't help matters that there was a separation between QA and the developers. Testers at Rockville say they were expressly forbidden from directly interacting with any of the non-QA developers, including the devs who worked on bug fixes. If QA testers found a major problem, they were usually expected to escalate to QA department leads rather than to specific designers. There was this middleman, essentially, they had to go through that just made the whole process far less efficient, caused significant delays in which a single issue could ping-pong back and forth for days or months. That would explain why QA feedback would take so long to get fixed, why pipelines were constantly delayed. This whole process didn't allow QA feedback to be acted upon in an immediate fashion. It was just delayed because of this whole middleman structure that didn't pave the road to the best form of communication and team cohesiveness. There was very much a misalignment between the business goal and the actual team members that proved to be devastating for morale. We were making a game that wasn't primarily for us, said a source. Meanwhile, Todd Howard is saying we are making a game that we want to play, that we want to make, when that's not true. Developers who came from the Fallout 4 team thought that Fallout 76 would disappoint a sizable chunk of their loyal audience. Quote, even though the studio has a reputation for buggy games, I initially still had faith that they would delay rather than putting out a bad game. Fallout 76 was never delayed. So the developers knew, okay, we're heading straight into the iceberg and this Titanic is gonna sink. They knew the game was not ready, yet management, the folks who can make the correct decision to delay the game, decided, let's just ship it as is, which shows a complete lack of respect for customers and also just a complete lack of respect towards developers. Fallout 76's development was so chaotic that one former employee wondered, I don't know how Bethesda made Skyrim. It doesn't make sense to me that game came together. But I mean, the game was fun, but at launch especially, and hell, on some level still now in its kind of vanilla state, it's not all there. There's still pieces that feel cobbled together. There's still rough edges, but the game was ultimately fun, and that made up for the technical issues surrounding the game. But by no means did people perceive the technical issues in Skyrim as something to be celebrated. Now, one source relayed that Bethesda is a big company that thinks it's a small company with a mentality of, well, this worked in the 90s, so we're just gonna keep doing it, which reminds me a bit of the whole BioWare magic where, just development cycles were strenuous, just awfully managed, but ultimately they shipped award-winning games, so instead of trying to improve that pipeline, they're like, why fix what ain't broken, except it was broken, but they relied on this whole BioWare magic aspect of, well, things work out in the end, so why mess with that? When it's you should always be striving to improve yourself, even if a previous endeavor was successful. If the road to that was rocky, try to smooth out that road. And with Bethesda, it would seem as though they have somewhat of a similar issue where they're stuck in the methods of the past. Apparently, it used to be much worse. Senior developers told us that we don't hear all about the good old days where people were sleeping in the office for Fallout 4. Management wants to run it like a 10-person QA department from the 80s, and that's just not how testing works. The crunch on Fallout 76 was also part of a larger tradition of valorized overtime, and this was not just the case for Bethesda Game Studio stuff, but this was seen in games such as Dishonored 2, Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus, Skyrim, and Fallout 4. We don't hear about those stories, but apparently things were pretty bad for the development of those games too. And while employees were not under a mandate to crunch or explicitly coerced to do so, developers still crunched on every one of these games because there's that peer pressure and that overall expectation of man, if I want to get promoted, I have to show that I'm going to work harder than everyone else. Now, while crunch wasn't mandated for these games right here from Bethesda's previous releases, both design and QA stated that crunch on Fallout 76 was in fact mandatory. Management said that if nobody volunteered for weekend overtime, then everybody would be called in. Peer pressure was the main motivator for crunch, as I mentioned, could improve their odds of being converted to full-time if they crunched, was the mentality, again, the dangling of that carrot that would bait people and employees into working harder. Despite the constant crunch, some testers believe that ZeniMax was one of the better companies since they converted QA to full-time instead of laying everyone off. Testers were still afraid of speaking up about their work conditions to leadership. However, even permanent employees just didn't have it good. If you're part of QA especially, you still had it rough. The fear they developed as temporary contractors persisted even after they were converted to permanent employees. They just felt like speaking up and recommending positive changes for the work environment would be met with retaliation. And then a former tester told Kotaku that they are not happy about the way Todd Howard presented things as if crunch was being better managed now. I find that absolutely disgusting that Howard said that Bethesda was really managing crunch, because it means that either he was really ignorant of what was going on or he didn't consider QA to be a part of the studio. And QA is such an important role that gets constantly underplayed and thrown under the bus. Kotaku then asked employees if they expect things to improve after the Microsoft Xbox acquisition of ZeniMax, under which Bethesda resides. When asked whether or not the acquisition had improved the internal work culture within Bethesda, several sources offered lukewarm responses. Microsoft's emphasis on a hands-off culture toward its studios meant that the new owners trusted Bethesda to take care of its own problems, which means that they're probably not going to interfere to try to improve their work culture. That is still up to Bethesda to get on that. The impression that I got, said a source, was that Microsoft would not make big changes unless they needed to. Phil Spencer, his preference is that studios be let to operate as they always have. Let the talent be the talent. Don't touch anything and mess up anything when you've got a studio that has put out successful games. Don't mess with that formula, I guess, is the mentality. One source spoke cynically about Bethesda's potential for changing from within. Bethesda HR is super cutthroat, says this source, and did not feel like Bethesda HR was actively interested in addressing any real employee concerns, which is why this investigation is so important, so that Bethesda can get called out, and hopefully that'll pave the road to either more employees speaking out or Bethesda seeing this as enough negative PR that they'll feel pressured into making positive changes. All right, we're delving now into the final bits of this article. Many Bethesda developers were excited at the prospect of improved employee benefits that might come with an acquisition such as healthcare, but apparently that's not something that Bethesda is going to see, despite Microsoft now being the owner of the company. Microsoft has like really amazing employee benefits, and they were just like, no, nothing is changing. Don't look at these benefits and think that you're going to get them. How messed up is that? At least Microsoft interfere on that aspect. Give the employees under your massive umbrella the same benefits, because they're serving the products that your company is outputting now. Finally, emotional damage that Fallout 76 inflicted on employees lingers. Again, a hellscape is what this all sounds like. When making games, when engaging in creative endeavors, despite being hard work, should ultimately be fun and filled with passion, and not this constant sense of dread and this constant sense of I'd rather break a bone than come into work. I mean, how awful must a work environment be to get to that level of mentality? So yeah, this really puts into context why Fallout 76 launched the way it did. A combination of poor management, mistreated workers, and just the developers not believing in this project in the same way as us, the customers, the players, the fans, the community members, were very skeptical about the concepts that were being presented for Fallout 76, like just no NPCs or just turning Fallout into a live service at all. And Todd Howard, from a marketing guy standpoint, as the face of Bethesda Game Studios, essentially, he spouted out so much BS, 16 times the detail being among the more infamous, but just straight up downplaying the crunch within the company and pretending like everyone was on board this project within the team when that's entirely not the case is just really not right. But there you have it, folks. This is some pretty important insight, and hopefully as this report and the information surrounding it spreads, Bethesda will improve. That's ultimately what I want. I'm not trying to like tear down any one company. With any company that I have issues with, all I'm hoping for is a brighter future, and hopefully Bethesda will kind of have some introspection about all of this and do what's right here and make the changes that need to happen. Listen to what the employees are saying, and that way games can be made in a better work environment, and in turn, games can be higher quality in the future. I guess we'll see what happens with Starfield, which was hampered on some level by Fallout 76, though hopefully things got back on track, and they did delay Starfield, so maybe that'll help just polish things up. Though the game, it does look rough around the edges. It looks old, but still has some really compelling concepts, and I do wish it the best. But yeah, that's one man's take, ladies and gentlemen. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this investigative report from Kotaku about Fallout 76's disastrous launch and its disastrous development. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.